A group of students are transported to a magical world where they will have to fight with many monsters. What they do not know is that they are being manipulated. This is the story of Nagumo from now on. The protagonist, he lives a quiet life of a normal student and anyone like you or me. Although some of his classmates hate him because he is popular with girls, although he considers himself an otaku. Until one day they are magically transported to a magical world. All of them are informed that they were summoned to this world because humans were losing the war with demons and being humans from another world. All the students had obtained talent and powers to fight. The protagonist is very excited to know which one it will be, his power. Yes! But the protagonist had not obtained any power, being the mockery of his companions. And in this way Arifureta begins, in 10 minutes. This group of students has the mission to become more and more powerful, in order to defeat the demons. That is why this group of students, to improve in battle, they are sent to fight in a labyrinth. The protagonist is still weak in his powers, seeing how his other classmates had risen a lot in level, being powerful. While exploring the labyrinth, one of his stupid classmates touches some crystals. It turns out that those crystals were a trap created by the monstrous boss. The boys have to fight with a powerful monster in order to survive. Here the battle with the monstrous boss begins. After a lot of fighting, the boys win. But since the protagonist wanted to protect one of his companions, the protagonist falls deep into the labyrinth and everyone thinks he is dead. In reality, the protagonist is not dead, he is more alive than ever but screwed up. This labyrinth is dark and scary. The protagonist walks everywhere to be able to leave this place and meet his friends, but he cannot. The hours passed and the protagonist was hungry. The protagonist was so hungry that he was willing to eat a bunny, but the shit is that the rabbit wants to eat him. No! No! The protagonist runs with all his might not to die. The worst of all is that he is still hungry. As he runs he realizes that another beast was following him, and was much more powerful, losing an arm. The protagonist is cornered, does not have an arm, and was very hungry. Before dying he remembers that one of his companions had attacked him in the confusion of the fight, and had fallen deep into the labyrinth. The tired protagonist of this magical world full of treacherous, decides that he will return to the world where he came, and those people who prevent him will die by his hands. Determined to return home, he decides to fight and fight with anything that prevents him from returning to his world. And for things in life the protagonist finds a miraculous water that heals all his wounds. Thus he manages to defeat the beast that was following him. As there was no need to eat he ends up eating the beast. At that moment he realizes that his ability allowed him to acquire the power of the monsters he ate and could create weapons thanks to the power of the transmutation. While he was eating the beast, he felt that this meat was killing him inside his stomach, but since he had the miraculous water, he ended up digesting and survived. The protagonist with the sole purpose of survival had fought with many monsters, and every time he was injured he drank their water to survive. With a new hair dye the protagonist becomes more and more powerful. As he progresses through the maze, he realizes that the monsters are becoming more and more powerful. As he could not find the exit, he decided to finish the maze. In one of his trips he ended up meeting a vampire girl who had been sealed. save me," says the girl. The protagonist does not want to, but then he does. Since she had been betrayed by her own people, and they had locked her in this place, supposedly because she was so powerful. The protagonist explains that he does not know how to get out of this place, so they will have to reach the end of the labyrinth. After many fights, the two reach the end of the maze. It was time to face the final boss. During the fight the protagonist is about to die, but is saved by the vampire girl since she had sucked some blood. While fighting the vampire girl falls in love. The two boys fight the beast and ultimately defeat it. Shortly after, they had arrived at the house of the creator of the labyrinth, but it turns out that he is already dead. The dead man explains that all the labyrinths that exist in the world had been created by people who fought against the gods, and that if he wants to fight against the gods he will have to learn ancient magic. The protagonist does not care about any of that, because he just wants to go home, when suddenly a magic floods his body, and he learns a little of this ancient magic. The protagonist feels that his magic power had become more powerful, and that now thanks to this magic the two of them could return to the surface. The little vampire wants to go with him. Just like the protagonist, she cannot bear this magical world. The boys stay a few days in this house in order to stabilize their powers and improve their abilities. Before leaving the labyrinth, the protagonist asks the vampire if she is willing to be by his side, because he was now more powerful, and even the gods would attack them. She answers yes. The protagonist promises to protect her, and she will protect him, promising to defeat anyone who gets in his way. And so the protagonists return to the surface thanks to ancient magic. The two boys were finally out of the maze, excited. When they meet a rabbit girl, he asks for their help. The protagonist does not want to help her because he does not want her to be a burden. The protagonist begins to think about why this girl was waiting for them. This rabbit girl explains that she has the power of clairvoyance, and that thanks to that power she was able to predict that they would come. The protagonist decides to help with the problem of this female rabbit to solve her problem. It turns out that there were monsters attacking his village, and they were in constant danger. Obviously, the protagonist manages to defeat all the monsters very easily. The rabbit, upon perceiving this great act of virility, falls in love. As a woman in love, she wants to go together with the protagonist. The protagonist does not want to, but then he does. The protagonist believes that it will be helpful because he had the power of clairvoyance. The locals, as a thank you, show him an entrance to a labyrinth. The protagonist excited because he knows that within each labyrinth he will find knowledge about ancient magic. As they go through the labyrinth, the rabbit girl turns out that she was not as weak as she seemed. As the three were powerful, they managed to reach the end of the labyrinth without much problem. They find a giant armor that they managed to defeat easily. It turns out that that giant armor had been controlled by a person. The boys capture it without problems and force it to give them something in exchange for defeating it. This little person simply gives them a ring with the affinity of gravity, being useful for the vampire girl. In the end, this little person expels them from his labyrinth. The boys fall into the middle of a lake. The protagonist worries because the rabbit had drowned. The protagonist tries to give her air through her mouth, but the rabbit takes advantage of that moment to stick her tongue on all sides. They had been evicted at random, so they head to a village to spend the night. The next day, the leader of the guild in that area is talking to them. He found out that the three had managed to get out of a dangerous canyon alive. He asks them to help save a person. He was the son of a duke. In exchange, the leader of the guild will help them if they have problems. The protagonist does not want to at first, but then he does. The three boys head to the northern mountains to search for the duke's son. They decide to take a break at an inn to eat. The protagonist ends up meeting his teacher and some classmates. The protagonist does not want to know anything about them, but since he had a little appreciation for his teacher, he ends up talking to them. As there were many people, the protagonist ends up accepting that his teacher and his companions accompany them on their rescue mission. In order not to take too long with the summary, they found the boy who was lost and told him that it was a dragon to blame. They seek the dragon to defeat it. They manage to capture the dragon to defeat it. As it had very hard scales, they cannot defeat it. The protagonist says that his only weak point is his ass and ends up putting a stick behind him. The protagonist thought that that way he would kill the dragon, but it turns out that the dragon began to moan with pleasure. This dragon explains that someone had controlled her mind to start killing people, and for them to believe her, she tells him that there are more than 60,000 controlled beasts heading to the town. The The protagonist uses his abilities to prove it, and it was true. The dragon had never felt pleasure from a rod in her ass and ends up falling in love with the protagonist. The boys defend the town from these beasts, while the protagonist finds the culprit of this disaster. It turns out that it had been one of his classmates. This boy had made a contract with the demons to have more power. The teacher tries to help him to reconsider, but it is impossible. This classmate had turned evil, poisoning his teacher in order to run away. And to save his teacher from poison, the protagonist gives him some of his miraculous water, but with style. Obviously, she falls in love.
It's time to stop!
The protagonist, tired of this person, kills him. The protagonists return to the city where they had received their mission to rescue the Duke's son. During their stay in that city, they meet a little girl. This little girl had been kidnapped by some evil men, but since she is the protagonist, she ends up saving her. Obviously falls in love with the protagonist.
What the f?
On any given day, the protagonist learns that his high school classmates are locked inside a maze, and that they cannot get out. The protagonist begins to remember that many of his high school classmates hated him. At first he doesn't want to, but then he remembers that many of his classmates treated him well, so he ends up accepting. Together with the other girls in the harem, the protagonist manages to defeat all the monsters and beasts. The friend thanks him for saving her and falls in love. Well, she was already in love more before, so she ends up proposing. The protagonist tells her that he cannot reciprocate her. In the end, she is invited to go with the protagonist by the vampire girl. All the girls are willing to travel with the protagonist, because they all want to fulfill the protagonist's dream, which is to return home. He will not allow anything or anyone to get in his way and his wishes. Thus ends the first season of Arifureta. I hope you liked it, and see you next time.